The air in the cave was thick with the smells of damp earth, sweat, and a fear so primal it felt like a physical presence. Outside, the midday Okinawan sun of late May 1945 beat down on a landscape torn raw by weeks of artillery, but here, in the cool limestone darkness, time seemed to stand still. 2 Marines from the 1st Division, rifles held at a low ready, peered into the blackness. They had cleared dozens of such holes in the ground, each one a potential nest of Japanese soldiers ready to fight to the last man with bayonet and grenade. A scrape of stone from within sent a jolt through them. Their fingers tightened on their triggers. A voice, not a battle cry but a woman's whimper, echoed from the depths. Then another, a child's cry. Using a Nisei interpreter who had crawled up with them, they called out, promising food and safety. Silence followed. Then slowly, a procession of ghosts emerged into the blinding light, emaciated women in tattered kimonos, children with vacant eyes, and old men stooped with exhaustion. They flinched from the Americans, their bodies rigid with terror. They had been told for months, for years, what to expect. They knew the invaders were Kichiku Beihei devilish, beastly American soldiers, who would subject them to unspeakable torture before killing them. This was the moment their government had prepared them for, the moment to choose a swift, honorable death over defilement. The battle for Okinawa was not merely a struggle for a piece of strategic rock 340 miles from Kyushu. It was a battle against an idea, a carefully constructed and lethal fiction planted in the minds of nearly 500,000 civilians. It was a war where the ultimate victory would not be measured by hills taken or enemies killed, but by the slow, painstaking effort to disprove a lie with gestures as simple as a canteen of clean water and a 4-ounce bar of chocolate. The strategic calculus behind Operation Iceberg, the Allied invasion of Okinawa, was brutally straightforward. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a relentless island-by-island advance. The Marianas had fallen, securing bases for the B-29 superfortress fleets that were systematically incinerating Japanese cities. Iwo Jima had been conquered at horrific cost, providing a crucial emergency landing field for those same bombers. Okinawa, part of the Ryukyu Island chain, was the final gatehouse. Its airfields would put Allied fighter planes within easy range of Japan's home islands, tightening the blockade and paving the way for the inevitable invasion, Operation Downfall. To take it, Admiral Chester Nimitz assembled the most powerful amphibious force in history, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, a staggering armada of over 1,300 warships and transports, tasked with landing and supporting Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr.'s 10th Army. The 10th Army was a massive hybrid force, combining the U.S. Army's XXIV Corps and the Marine Corps, III Amphibious Corps, for a total of more than 183,000 combat troops. They were the tip of a spear whose shaft extended all the way back to the shipyards of California and the factories of Pennsylvania. They expected a bloodbath on the beaches, a repeat of the volcanic ash hell of Iwo Jima. Defending the island was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army. His force numbered around 77,000 regular Imperial Japanese Army troops, augmented by some 20,000 hastily conscripted Okinawan Home Guard members, the Boitai, and thousands more auxiliary laborers. Unlike previous Japanese commanders, Ushijima had no intention of wasting his men in futile banzai charges against the landing beaches. He knew he could not defeat the American armada. His strategy, dictated by the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, was one of attrition. He would concede the beaches and the northern two-thirds of the island, pulling his main forces into a formidable multi-layered defensive zone in the south. This labyrinth of interlocking caves, tunnels, and fortified ridges, anchored by the ancient Shuri Castle, would be known to the Americans as the Shuri Line. Here Ushijima would bleed the 10th Army dry, buying precious time for the defense of the homeland. And caught squarely between these two colossal military machines was the island's civilian population, numbering around 300,000. For them, Ushijima's strategy was a death sentence. The Japanese military government had spent years indoctrinating them with a fanatical creed: death was preferable to surrender. The emperor was a living god, and to fall into enemy hands was the ultimate disgrace. American soldiers, they were taught in schools and public lectures, were inhuman monsters. The civilians were not to be bystanders. They were to become part of the fortress and, if necessary, part of the sacrifice. On Easter Sunday, April 1, 1945, L-Day, the invasion began. Following a week of the most intense naval bombardment of the war, waves of landing craft churned toward the Higashi beaches on Okinawa's western coast. The men of the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions and the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions braced for the machine gun fire that had scythed down their comrades on other Pacific islands. But it never came. The beaches were eerily quiet. Within hours, nearly 60,000 troops were ashore, moving inland against only sporadic opposition. They seized the Yontan and Kadena airfields with astonishing speed. It felt too easy, a phantom victory that put every veteran on edge. The real battle, they understood, lay somewhere ahead. As the troops advanced, they began to encounter the first Okinawan civilians, who were hiding in small family tombs, called *Haka*, that dotted the hillsides. The official American policy was clear. Nimitz had issued Proclamation No. 1, establishing a U.S. naval military government and promising that civilians who did not resist would be treated humanely. But policy made in a flagship office was one thing, implementing it in a combat zone was another. GIs, trained to see every shadow as a threat, were wary. The civilians, their minds filled with images of torture, were petrified. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Nisei interpreters, Japanese-American soldiers whose linguistic skills were indispensable, would call out to the hidden families. Sometimes there was no response. Sometimes a grenade would be thrown, but often, after long, tense minutes, the people would emerge, expecting the worst. Instead, they were searched, processed, and directed toward the rear, where the first collection points and internment camps were being hastily established. The propaganda had met its first test, and for these few, it had been proven false. The illusion of an easy campaign shattered within a week. As the XXIV Corps pushed south, they ran headlong into the outer ramparts of Ushijima's fortress, the Shuri Line. The landscape transformed from rolling hills into a jagged hell of steep escarpments, deep ravines, and limestone ridges perfectly suited for defense. The first major obstacle was Kakazu Ridge, a heavily fortified position that stalled the American advance for days. The fighting devolved into a brutal, close-quarters struggle. American M4 Sherman tanks were picked off by concealed 47 anti-tank guns. Infantry assaults were met with a storm of machine gun and mortar fire from positions that were all but invisible and impervious to artillery. This was the war of attrition Ushijima had planned, and its violence was apocalyptic. For the Okinawan civilians huddled in caves and tombs just behind the Japanese lines, the thunder of battle was the sound of their indoctrination being confirmed. The sheer destructive power of the American military, the naval gunfire that vaporized ridges, the Corsair fighters dropping napalm that turned valleys into seas of fire, seemed to validate every story of American monstrosity. Japanese soldiers moved among them, reinforcing the fear. They told the civilians that the Americans would show no mercy, that it was their duty to die for the emperor. This was the first great turning point of the civilian experience, the moment when abstract propaganda was seemingly made real by the terrifying chaos of combat. It was in these first weeks of fighting in the South that the mass suicides began. In some cases, Japanese soldiers directly ordered families to kill themselves or provided them with grenades to do the job. In others, driven by pure terror, families took their own lives, believing it was the only escape from the foreign devils. The battle had become a two-front war for the Americans, a physical one against the 32nd Army and a psychological one for the trust of the very people they were trying to save. The contrast was jarring, a moral and emotional whiplash that defined the experience for many American servicemen. In one moment, a Marine was using a flamethrower to incinerate a pillbox defended by soldiers who would fight to the death. In the next, he might be confronted by a terrified child stumbling out of a nearby cave. The official policy of humane treatment trickled down to the squad level, but it was often left to the discretion and conscience of individual GIs, men who were exhausted, frightened, and hardened by the loss of their friends. Eugene Sledge, a mortarman with the 1st Marine Division, later recalled the profound confusion of these encounters. He described giving his rations to starving civilians, watching them eat ravenously while their eyes remained wide with fear and suspicion. One soldier of the 77th Infantry Division, which had been reassigned from mop-up operations on other islands to help break the Shuri Line stalemate, remembered offering a piece of a chocolate D-ration to a small girl. The girl's mother snatched her back, hissing at her, convinced the food was poisoned. He simply left the chocolate on a rock and backed away. He later saw the girl creep back and devour it. It was a tiny victory in a war of inches and brutal momentum. A combat photographer noted the surreal sight of big, tough Marines taking from their packs candy and crackers and giving them to the kids. These were not organized, top-down directives in the heat of battle. They were spontaneous acts of decency that served as the first cracks in the wall of Japanese propaganda, small gestures that whispered a different story than the one the civilians had been forced to believe. As the battle for the Shuri Line bogged down into a slogging match reminiscent of the Western Front in World War I, the American logistical machine began to assert its dominance in a new way. The initial mission was to supply the 10th Army with the tools of war, millions of rounds of ammunition, tens of thousands of artillery shells, and rivers of gasoline. But as more and more terrified civilians either surrendered or were bypassed by the American advance, a second, parallel supply chain began to form. Military government teams, often working just behind the front lines, established collection points. They faced a humanitarian catastrophe. The refugees were starving, dehydrated, and suffering from a host of diseases. Many were wounded. The first priority was medical care. Medics armed with sulfur powder and blood plasma worked to save who they could. The second was food and water. The American K-ration, a day's worth of meals in a waxed cardboard box, became a tool of diplomacy. While GIs might complain about its monotonous contents, for the Okinawans it was a miracle. Each box contained biscuits, a small can of processed meat or cheese, a packet of instant coffee or a Bouillon cube, and crucially, a few pieces of hard candy or a stick of gum. More substantial were the C-rations, canned meals of stew or hash, but the most symbolic item was the D-ration. This was not candy in the traditional sense. It was a 600-calorie, 4-ounce bar of bitter, semi-sweet chocolate, fortified with vitamins and designed to withstand high temperatures. To a starving civilian, it was pure energy and a profound symbol. The Japanese military had demanded they sacrifice everything for a spiritual ideal. The Americans were handing them concentrated calories, the material stuff of life itself. The logistical capacity to fight a total war and simultaneously mount a massive humanitarian relief effort was something Ushijima's command could not comprehend, let alone counter. It would be a distortion of history, however, to paint the American treatment of civilians as uniformly compassionate. The reality on the ground was far more complex and often grim. The battle for Okinawa was one of the most brutal of the entire war, and the psychological strain on American troops was immense. They watched friends die in horrific ways, often at the hands of an enemy who used civilians as human shields or feigned surrender before detonating a hidden grenade. This bred a deep-seated suspicion, and in some cases, a hardened cruelty. There were documented instances of GIs shooting civilians they mistook for soldiers or simply out of rage and fear. The desperation to acquire souvenirs, particularly swords and flags, sometimes led to the desecration of Japanese dead and the mistreatment of prisoners. Furthermore, the very nature of the fighting made distinguishing combatant from non-combatant nearly impossible. The Boitai wore no standard uniform, and even teenage girls were sometimes used as battlefield nurses or to smuggle explosives. For a soldier clearing a cave, the hesitation to shoot could be fatal. This created a dangerous paradox. The official policy was humane, but the tactical reality often encouraged a shoot-first mentality. The Okinawan fear, while magnified by propaganda, was not entirely baseless. They were trapped between an army that saw them as expendable pawns and another that saw them as potential threats, a populace caught in the unforgiving gears of modern industrial warfare, where their individual humanity was often the first casualty. The story of candy and compassion was real, but it ran parallel to a darker story of violence and survival. By late May, after weeks of relentless pressure and staggering casualties on both sides, the Shuri line finally began to crumble. A daring amphibious landing by the 6th Marine Division on the Oroku Peninsula outflanked a key part of the Japanese defenses, while a frontal assault by the 1st Marine Division captured the heights of Wana Ridge. The final linchpin, Sugar Loaf Hill, fell after a 10-day battle that cost the Marines over 2,600 casualties. With his lines breached and his forces decimated, General Ushijima made a fateful decision on May 21st. He ordered a withdrawal from the Shuri fortress to a last-ditch defensive line on the southern tip of the island, around the Kiamu Peninsula. This retreat was a chaotic, desperate affair conducted under torrential rains that turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. It was also a death march for tens of thousands of civilians. The 32nd Army forced them from their shelters, using them as cover and clearing the caves for military use. Fleeing south with the retreating army, they were caught in the open, directly in the path of the American advance and its devastating artillery fire. As the 10th Army closed the trap in June, the fighting reached its ultimate climax of horror on the southern cliffs near Mabuni, where Ushijima had established his final headquarters in a cave known as Hill 89. Here, the remnants of the Japanese army and thousands of civilians were cornered. U.S. psychological warfare teams set up loudspeakers, broadcasting pleas for surrender. They had Okinawan prisoners speak to their own people, assuring them of good treatment. Some listened. Droves of civilians, their will to resist broken, began to surrender. But for many, the propaganda still held sway. Japanese soldiers, imbued with the belief that surrender was unthinkable, executed those who tried to give up and urged others to leap from the cliffs to their deaths. From his command post deep within the earth, Ushijima could hear the battle raging outside, the crack of rifles, the roar of flamethrowers, and the desperate cries of his people. The end came on June 22, 1945. With American soldiers fighting just outside his cave headquarters, General Ushijima, along with his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, performed the ritual of seppuku. Ushijima calmly composed a final message, then plunged a knife into his own abdomen before being dispatched by his adjutant. His suicide marked the end of organized resistance on Okinawa. The 82-day battle was over. The island was declared secure, but the cost was astronomical. The American 10th Army suffered over 49,000 casualties, including 12,520 killed or missing. It was the costliest single campaign for the U.S. military in the Pacific War. Lieutenant General Buckner himself was among the dead, killed by an artillery shell on June 18 while observing the front lines, making him the highest-ranking American officer to be killed by enemy fire in the war. Japanese losses were even more catastrophic. An estimated 110,000 defenders were killed, with only 7,400 taken prisoner, a testament to their fanatical resistance. But the greatest tragedy was borne by the Okinawan people. While precise figures are impossible to ascertain, estimates of civilian deaths range from 40,000 to as high as 150,000, perhaps a full third of the island's population. They were killed by crossfire, by artillery, by suicide, and by disease and starvation. Yet amid the carnage, the secondary mission had succeeded in a way few could have imagined. By the end of the fighting, U.S. military government teams were managing a network of 15 internment camps, providing food, shelter, and medical care to over 160,000 displaced civilians. The lie had been defeated. In the quiet that followed the final battle, the proof of that victory was not found in a treaty or a parade, but in the mundane logistics of the refugee camps. At places like Tara and Kozu, long lines of Okinawans waited patiently as GIs ladled out reconstituted milk or stew made from sea rations. Doctors and nurses vaccinated children and treated the sick. The very system that had unleashed unimaginable destruction upon their island was now being used to sustain them. The Hershey's D-ration, the K-ration's hard candy, the chewing gum, these small items became powerful artifacts. They were tangible evidence that refuted the abstract, death-driven ideology of the Japanese military government. The propaganda had told them the Americans were demons who would bring only pain. The reality was that these same Americans were the only source of food and medicine. The ultimate weapon against the fiction of the Kichiku Beihei was not a bullet or a bomb, but the overwhelming productive and logistical might of the United States, an industrial power capable of projecting not only force, but also sustenance. It was this material reality that finally severed the grip of the state-sponsored myth. The battle for Okinawa was a horrific demonstration of the human cost of total war, but it also revealed a fundamental truth, that an ideology built on fear and deprivation could, in the end, be dismantled by the simple, undeniable reality of a helping hand and a piece of chocolate.